Do you want to know something intimate, something profoundly true, perhaps unsettlingly, so that nobody, absolutely nobody in your polite conforming world has likely ever directly honestly confessed to you before? You are trapped. Yes, you. Right now, in this very moment, as you read these words, you are likely confined, perhaps suffocatingly, within the invisible yet incredibly strong, almost inescapable walls of a jail, a psychological, emotional prison that you yourself meticulously, perhaps unknowingly, yet diligently built brick by painstaking, fear-laden brick. With every significant decision you made, primarily contemplating, agonizing over what others might say or think, with every potentially meaningful, soul-aligned action that you stopped yourself abruptly from doing, paralyzed by a crippling, pervasive fear of failing, of looking foolish, of not meeting some arbitrary external standard. With every polite, socially acceptable, yet utterly fake, soul-crushing smile that skillfully, perhaps habitually hid your authentic, perhaps desperate primal desire to scream, in frustration, in pain, in sheer bone-deep exhaustion. Do you recognize, truly recognize that subtle yet persistent oppressive weight in your chest? That low-grade, constant background hum of anxiety? That pervasive feeling of being perpetually constrained, limited, hemmed in? It's likely not just simple everyday anxiety, the kind easily dismissed or medicated away. It's not merely the predictable stress of modern living. It is far more profoundly, far more existentially, the almost unbearable weight of a life lived primarily for others. A life meticulously designed, consciously or unconsciously calibrated, to please spectators, to meet external expectations. Spectators who ironically, tragically, don't even pay an admission fee. Don't even fully appreciate the exhausting, often heartbreaking performance of your carefully curated existence. And do you know what constitutes the cruelest, most poignant, most soul-destroying aspect of this pervasive, often invisible, self-imposed confinement? Nobody actually explicitly asked you to make that profound, life-altering sacrifice. Nobody explicitly demanded that you willingly, almost eagerly, give up your inherent birthright, freedom, relinquish your unique, irreplaceable essence, compromise your fundamental core authenticity on the altar of social acceptance. But somehow, somewhere along the treacherous path of conditioning, of seeking belonging, of avoiding disapproval, you did it voluntarily. You allowed yourself, perhaps gradually, perhaps decisively, to become chained psychologically, tethered to the often unspoken yet deeply felt, powerfully enforced expectations of others, family, peers, culture, perhaps even imagined judges. You effectively, tragically sold your true identity, your sovereign self, in exchange for the fleeting, ephemeral, ultimately unsatisfying applause of social approval, for the momentary, addictive yet hollow hit of external validation. And now, perhaps in rare moments of quiet, unflinching introspection, now that you dare, perhaps tentatively, fearfully, to look inside, beyond the facade, beyond the performance, what truly, genuinely remains of you. What authentic part, what core essence still breathes, however faintly, beneath the heavy layers of performance, adaptation, and self-betrayal? And what significant, perhaps dominant portion of your current self has been unconsciously, insidiously shaped by pervasive fear, molded by gnawing insecurity, sculpted by that often sick, culturally amplified, relentless need to simply fit in, to belong at any cost, even the cost of your own soul? They, society with its relentless messaging, perhaps your specific upbringing with its unique set of pressures, maybe even well-intentioned yet ultimately misguided self-help gurus peddling simplistic formulas for happiness, likely made you believe implicitly or explicitly that control was the ultimate key, the magic formula, the non-negotiable prerequisite for achieving happiness, security, and a life well lived. They relentlessly, seductively sold you the pervasive, deeply appealing, yet fundamentally dangerous illusion that if you could just meticulously, perfectly manage every single aspect of your life, your career trajectory, your relationship status, your emotional responses, your physical appearance, your public image, then everything would inevitably, magically, finally turn out well. Everything would finally be perfect, secure, predictable, safe, predictable. Do you want to know the stark, often uncomfortable, yet ultimately profoundly liberating truth that nobody, absolutely nobody, benefiting from your compliance typically dares to tell you absolute control is a lie. A dangerous, energy-draining, soul-crushing mental trap expertly designed, perhaps unconsciously perpetuated by culture, by systems of power, and perhaps most insidiously by your own fearful, insecure ego, primarily, arguably, to keep you perpetually busy, distracted, anxious, fundamentally disconnected from what truly, deeply, authentically matters in the brief, precious, unrepeatable span of your existence. The more desperately, obsessively you strive for grasp for absolute control, the more relentlessly, anxiously you try to micromanage every external detail, every potential outcome, every perceived threat. The more inexorably, inevitably, you slide towards chronic anxiety, towards silent gnawing, desperation towards a life that you ultimately never fully joyfully finish living, because you are perpetually, exhaustingly, neurotically busy, preparing for some idealized, perfectly controlled, utterly predictable future, some mythical state of permanent safety and satisfaction that by the very chaotic, unpredictable, flowing nature of reality itself never actually arrives. Have you ever paused amidst the relentless striving, the constant doing, to genuinely deeply wonder why you often feel that persistent, inexplicable aching void deep within that sense of something vital missing, despite perhaps by all conventional external measures appearing to have it all? The successful career, the socially approved relationship, the comfortable home, the outward appearance of a life well lived. It's frequently profoundly because what you possess externally, what you have accumulated, what you have achieved isn't genuinely, authentically yours, in a deep, soul-aligned sense. Your perceived success, your established relationships, perhaps even many of your most deeply held thoughts, beliefs, and opinions are often subtly yet pervasively contaminated, distorted, compromised by the constant underlying, often unconscious worry about how they will be perceived, judged, evaluated by others. And the more intensely, desperately you seek that elusive, fickle external validation, the further, often unknowingly, tragically you drift away from your own center, from your inner compass, from that quiet, true, authentic essence that perhaps you once knew how to recognize intuitively, effortlessly as a child, but that now, after years upon years of relentless conditioning, of prioritizing external approval over internal alignment, you barely even remember exists, let alone know how to access or trust. Michel de Montaigne, that wise, introspective French essayist, writing with profound, timeless insight from the quiet, reflective solitude of his library tower in the tumultuous 16th century, saw with remarkable, almost prophetic clarity what many of us today, immersed in our hyper-connected, hyper-stimulated, hyper-anxious world, desperately, fearfully don't want to accept. That true psychological detachment is not cold indifference, not cynical apathy, not a resigned withdrawal from the world, but rather it is the only viable, sustainable path towards authentic inner freedom, towards genuine peace, towards a life lived with grace, resilience, and integrity amidst the inherent chaos and unpredictability of existence. He understood centuries ago what modern psychology is only now beginning to fully appreciate, that we live largely trapped, psychologically imprisoned, not primarily by adverse external circumstances, by misfortune, or by the actions of others, but fundamentally, pervasively, cripplingly, by our own sick attempt to control the inherently uncontrollable, by our pervasive, culturally amplified obsession to please others, to seamlessly fit in, to meticulously, anxiously avoid criticism, disapproval, rejection, failure, discomfort at all costs, even the cost of our own souls. But what if dare to consider this radical possibility right now, that the very detachment you likely so deeply fear, the conscious letting go of outcomes you cannot ultimately determine, the deliberate release of the exhausting need for constant external approval, the courageous acceptance of life's inherent uncertainty is precisely exactly the key that unlocks the heavy, rusted door to your long-sought, perhaps desperately craved authentic freedom? What genuinely, truly would happen deep within your being if just for a moment, just for today, you dared to consciously, deliberately let go of that metaphorical, suffocating rope you are currently holding onto so tightly with white-knuckled desperation, that rope of perceived control of needing to manage everything, that rope of desperately seeking approval of needing everyone to like you, that rope of meticulously maintaining appearances, of performing a role that isn't truly you, the very rope that you mistakenly, tragically believe saves you, protects you, keeps you safe, but that in reality is slowly, inexorably, silently suffocating the life, the vitality, the spontaneity, the joy out of your authentic self. Because here lies the profound, often counterintuitive, yet fundamentally liberating paradox at the heart of Montaigne's wisdom, and indeed at the core of much spiritual and psychological insight. The more desperately you try to control external events and others' perceptions of you, the less actual control you ultimately possess over your own inner state, your own peace of mind, your own emotional equilibrium. The more relentlessly, anxiously you seek to please everyone around you, compromising your values, silencing your truth, the less authentically you become, fading into a generic, agreeable, yet ultimately hollow reflection of external expectations. And the more vehemently, rigidly you resist the inevitable natural flow of change, of uncertainty, of impermanence, the stronger, more disruptive, more painful its impact often feels when it inevitably, unavoidably comes, as it always does. The world reality itself simply does not function under your direct absolute control, and it never, ever will. Accepting this fundamental, perhaps humbling, yet ultimately empowering truth is not a sign of weakness, defeat, or resignation. It is rather the very foundation, the cornerstone of profound wisdom, resilience, and inner peace. Life in all its inherent glorious chaos, its beautiful yet often terrifying unpredictability, its constant flux, ultimately demands something remarkably simple yet often profoundly terrifying, profoundly challenging from us: the willingness, the courage, the grace to let go. Let go of your deeply ingrained, often unconscious need for constant universal approval. Recognize that it's an impossible, exhausting, soul-destroying pursuit. Let go of your paralyzing, often irrational fear of failing, of making mistakes, of not living up to some impossible, externally imposed ideal of perfection. Embrace imperfection as the very essence of being human, as the fertile ground for growth and learning. Let go, piece by painful, liberating piece, of that false identity, that carefully constructed, socially acceptable mask, that confining persona you have diligently, perhaps exhaustingly created over the years, primarily to protect yourself, your vulnerable core, from the anticipated, often exaggerated sting of others' judgment, criticism, or rejection. Imagine just for a second, truly visualize it, feel it in your body. What would truly, genuinely happen? How would your life fundamentally change if you consciously, deliberately stopped worrying so much about the fluctuating, often arbitrary, frequently uninformed opinions of others? Who would you be without that constant, underlying corrosive fear, shaping your choices, dictating your actions, silencing your authentic voice? What would you genuinely do? What risks would you take? What passions would you pursue? What truths would you speak if you possessed the deep, unwavering inner knowing that nobody, absolutely nobody, could ever truly, fundamentally judge the core of your being, your intrinsic worth, that person you glimpse in your mind right now in that moment of imaginative freedom, that freer, bolder, more authentic, more alive version of yourself, living without those heavy, self-imposed mental chains that is fundamentally, essentially who you really are, beneath the accumulated layers of conditioning, fear, and performance that is the sovereign self waiting to be reclaimed. But there's often something even darker, something deeper, something more psychologically complex, lurking behind this uncomfortable reality of our fear-driven, approval-seeking lives. And it's the unsettling, perhaps terrifying possibility that you desperately, subconsciously fear letting go of control, letting go of the relentless need for approval, precisely because deep down you genuinely don't know who you are, without those familiar chains, without that external scaffolding, without those defining roles and expectations. You're perhaps terrified on an existential level to discover that your sense of identity, your very feeling of self, has become so diluted over time, so inextricably, perhaps dangerously mixed with external expectations, societal validation, and the reflections you see in others' eyes, that upon finally, courageously letting go of all that external scaffolding, maybe terrifyingly nothing substantial, nothing solid, nothing authentically, you would remain. The void beckons and it feels like annihilation. But here lies the ultimately liberating, albeit initially brutal, existential truth that Michel de Montaigne seemed to whisper across the centuries from the quiet, introspective solitude of his tower. By consciously, courageously, deliberately letting go of what you fundamentally are not, the masks you wear, the roles you perform, the borrowed beliefs you've adopted, the fear-based motivations that drive you, the identities constructed solely for external approval, for the very first time, you create the necessary sacred inner space to clearly, authentically see, feel, and know what you genuinely truly are. The emptiness is not an end, it is a clearing, a prerequisite for authentic discovery. The profound, lasting freedom you so desperately, perhaps unconsciously seek, resides not in achieving perfect external control, not in gaining universal approval, but precisely paradoxically, just on the other side of the very fear that currently paralyzes you, the fear of letting go, the fear of uncertainty, the fear of not knowing, the fear of being truly authentically yourself. It is not hidden within the pages of another cleverly marketed self-help book promising quick fixes. It is not embedded within catchy, superficial motivational advice designed for fleeting inspiration. It is certainly not concealed within any mystical, secret, external guru or esoteric doctrine promising effortless enlightenment. It is here, available within you, accessible within your own consciousness, in this precise present moment, patiently, eternally waiting for you to finally summon enough inner courage, enough radical self-honesty, enough weariness with the old exhausting game to face your own life squarely, look your own fears unflinchingly in the eye, and declare with quiet yet unwavering revolutionary conviction, I no longer fundamentally need anyone else's approval to feel intrinsically worthy. I no longer need to desperately, futilely control the inherently unpredictable, uncontrollable nature of life. I no longer need to exhaust myself, betray myself, diminish myself, pretending to be who I am not. Now tell me honestly, addressing the deepest part of yourself, are you truly, genuinely ready to begin the arduous yet profoundly rewarding process of letting go, of releasing the illusion of control, of dismantling the prison of external validation? Or will you continue, perhaps indefinitely, instinctively, fearfully clinging to the familiar illusion of control, knowing deep down with a growing sense of despair that each day that passes lived in fear conformity? And self-betrayal potentially takes you further and further away from your own true, precious, irreplaceable essence, from the authentic life you were perhaps meant to live. This right here is merely the beginning, the threshold of a profound, potentially life-altering inner journey. A journey you may not consciously want to make due to its inherent, unavoidable discomfort, its challenge to your ego, its threat to your familiar reality, but one that your soul, your deeper self, desperately, urgently needs if you desire authentic freedom, lasting peace, genuine fulfillment, and the ultimate decision. The power to embark or remain rests solely, entirely, irrevocably in your hands. Will you choose to continue living, perhaps comfortably, predictably, yet fundamentally confined within a gilded cage, meticulously built, maintained, reinforced by your own fears, your own attachments, your own societal conditioning? Or will you finally courageously accept the inherent, unavoidable risk, the existential leap of launching yourself into the unknown, into a state of freedom, of authenticity, that may initially terrify you with its profound lack of guarantees, its absence of familiar landmarks, but that ultimately undeniably holds the profound sacred potential to make you finally, truly, vibrantly feel authentically alive, perhaps for the very first time? Welcome then to the timeless, liberating philosophy of detachment, of inner freedom, as understood and embodied by Michel de Montaigne. Welcome to the potentially life-altering, paradigm-shifting pursuit of an inner freedom, an emotional sovereignty that promises to change absolutely everything you thought you knew about yourself, your life, your potential, and your fundamental relationship to the vast, mysterious, uncontrollable world. The path ahead is undoubtedly unsettling, challenging, perhaps even lonely at times as old structures fall away, but I assure you, with unwavering certainty grounded in the wisdom of ages, the only thing ultimately more terrifying, more soul-destroying than consciously moving towards that authentic, uncertain freedom is passively, fearfully choosing to remain exactly, comfortably, miserably where you are right now, forever trapped in the known prison of your own making. You have likely been thoroughly, relentlessly convinced through years upon years of pervasive cultural messaging societal pressure, and perhaps even well-intentioned educational systems that relentlessly pursuing external goals, accumulating wealth, achieving status, climbing the career ladder, attaining the socially sanctioned perfect relationship, acquiring the right possessions, projecting the correct image, is the single most important, most valuable, most meaningful endeavor in human life. The unquestioned Holy Grail. But what would happen, truly fundamentally happen deep within your psyche, within your soul, if you suddenly irrevocably discovered, perhaps through a crisis, perhaps through quiet reflection, perhaps through reading these very words, that most, perhaps even all of those meticulously, often exhaustingly pursued external goals were never really authentically yours to begin with, that they were largely inherited ambitions, borrowed desires, culturally implanted aspirations. Imagine this scenario vividly. All your life, you have been diligently, perhaps even sacrificially, exhaustingly striving to climb ladders meticulously constructed by others' ladders representing purely societal, often materialistic definitions of success, acceptance, and worth, without ever pausing long enough, deeply enough to genuinely critically question whether you, in your own unique, authentic essence, truly deeply wanted to arrive at that specific and predetermined destination at the top, and now perhaps having reached a certain respectable rung, maybe even nearing the perceived highly lauded summit, when you finally perhaps breathlessly pause to look around to take stock, what do you honestly truly see? Is it the breathtaking, soul-stirring panorama of fulfillment you always dreamed of, the one promised by the societal script, or is it merely perhaps tragically the distorted, hollow reflection of what someone else, perhaps your parents carrying their own unlived dreams, perhaps your peers competing in the same unconscious race, perhaps the prevailing, often manipulative culture itself, implicitly or explicitly wanted, expected, demanded you to be, to achieve, to become? We live immersed, almost drowning in a culture fundamentally, dangerously obsessed with a narrow, rigid, often soul-crushingly materialistic definition of success. We operate largely unconsciously under the pervasive, often unquestioned belief that finally achieving certain externally validated goals, the prestigious promotion, the bigger house in the right neighborhood, the conventionally attractive partner, the impressive bank account balance, the curated social media feed projecting effortless perfection, will somehow, magically, automatically grant us lasting peace, genuine contentment, profound fulfillment, a sense of intrinsic worth. But have you ever genuinely, truly stopped amidst the frantic pursuit to rigorously, radically question what exactly success truly, authentically is, beyond these superficial, transient, often meaningless external markers? And perhaps even more importantly, more fundamentally, whose definition of success, whose values, whose agenda are you actually currently, perhaps unconsciously chasing? Is it truly your own, born from your deepest, most authentic values, passions, and desires? Or is it one you passively, uncritically inherited, unconsciously absorbed, dutifully adopted, without ever truly examining its validity, its cost, its alignment with your own soul? Perhaps you have already diligently, successfully achieved several of those conventional goals, those external milestones that were supposedly, implicitly or explicitly guaranteed to make you happy, fulfilled, secure. You studied the right practical subject. You secured the corresponding respectable job. You cultivated relationships with the right kind of influential or acceptable people. You acquired the expected material possessions. You ticked all the external boxes on the societal checklist. And yet, despite achieving all of this, despite playing the game according to the established rules, perhaps even winning by conventional standards, you still feel that persistent nagging, often inexplicable sense that something profound, something vital, something essential is missing. That underlying uncomfortable feeling, that quiet yet undeniable truth that sometimes surfaces in the vulnerable, unguarded hours of the night, waking you from restless sleep, is very likely the insistent, perhaps desperate voice you've ignored, suppressed, rationalized away for far too long. It is your own authentic essence, your deeper, wiser self, desperately, urgently demanding, perhaps pleading to finally be heard, acknowledged, honored, integrated, lived. Michel de Montaigne, during his periods of chosen voluntary confinement and strategic withdrawal from the incessant, often meaningless noise and demanding pressures of the external world, discovered through deep introspection and radical self-honesty, something profoundly revealing, potentially even dangerous to the established social order, deeply challenging to the productivity-obsessed status quo, that true success, authentic fulfillment, genuine contentment, often looks nothing like the heavily marketed, socially sanctioned, externally validated version relentlessly sold to you by the prevailing culture. It is not fundamentally primarily about achieving a specific elevated social position or title. It is not merely or even significantly about the endless, insatiable accumulation of material goods or monetary wealth. It is not even ultimately truly dependent on receiving external recognition, fleeting applause, or the fickle admiration of the crowd. True success, the kind that genuinely nourishes the soul, the kind that fosters deep inner peace, the kind precious few dare to genuinely, authentically pursue because it requires introspection, courage, and a willingness to deviate from the herd, lies simply, yet profoundly often, arduously, in living fully, vibrantly, unapologetically aligned with your own unique nature, your authentic core values, your deepest, most resonant truth regardless of external outcomes or opinions. But of course, therein lies the fundamental, often terrifying challenge, the crux of the existential dilemma. To live in authentic alignment with your own true nature, you first absolutely, unequivocally have to know who you really are, beyond the carefully constructed, socially acceptable mask, the persona in Jungian terms, beyond the heavy, often suffocating weight of external expectations and internalized shoulds, and beyond that often polished, performative, yet ultimately false, exhausting version of yourself that you habitually, perhaps unconsciously present to the world, and perhaps even to yourself each and every single day. You have likely become so incredibly accustomed, so deeply conditioned to pretending, to performing the expected roles, to wearing the appropriate masks for each social situation that you don't even consciously notice anymore. The immense constant effort, the profound psychic energy you expend daily, hourly, simply to sustain an image, a facade that doesn't genuinely fully represent the complex, multifaceted, often contradictory individual residing, perhaps trapped, perhaps yearning, within. But the mind, particularly the unconscious, the body itself, is relentless, unforgiving in its pursuit of truth and wholeness, even if you consciously try to ignore the inner dissonance, the growing, gnawing sense of inauthenticity, the quiet desperation of the unlived life. There will always be something vital, essential within you that subtly yet persistently powerfully rebels, something that sooner or later inevitably, perhaps disruptively breaks the facade, manifesting perhaps as inexplicable anxiety, persistent depression, chronic fatigue, debilitating burnout, bewildering psychosomatic ailments, or sudden seemingly irrational acts of self-sabotage, your soul protesting its confinement. Want another uncomfortable yet potentially profoundly liberating truth. As long as you continue hiding behind characters you didn't write, playing roles that aren't authentically yours, performing for an audience whose approval you don't truly need, you will likely never know true, deep, unshakable tranquility. The pervasive stress, the chronic anxiety, the constant gnawing feeling of emptiness, of being fundamentally disconnected from yourself and life, are often simply the logical, predictable, unavoidable consequences of a life lived primarily for others, perpetually disconnected from your own authentic core, your own inner truth, your own sovereign self. But here comes the tricky, often paralyzing psychological part. The insight Montaigne explored with startling clarity and honesty in his essays. Most people instinctively, perhaps understandably, prefer the perceived security, the predictability, the sheer familiarity of an uncomfortable, perhaps even miserable yet known life over the inherent unavoidable risk, the terrifying uncertainty, the potential chaos involved in courageously facing the prospect of truly, authentically being themselves. They prefer, often unconsciously, to continue living a kind of half-life, a compromised existence settling for mere crumbs of happiness, fleeting moments of pleasure or validation, temporary distractions from the underlying ache, rather than confronting the potentially terrifying yet ultimately liberating risk of discovering who they really are beneath the accumulated layers of conditioning fear and performance. The known prison often feels safer than the unknown freedom. And you, which group right now in this moment of reflection do you currently find yourself in? Are you one of those possessing the rare, perhaps burgeoning courage, willing to assume the inherent, unavoidable risk involved in the profound, sacred journey of finding, reclaiming, and living your authentic self? Or are you one of those who instinctively, perhaps fearfully, perhaps comfortably, prefer to remain safely, predictably, perhaps miserably numbed, sedated, distracted by the predictable, soul-deadening rhythms of routine, conformity, and external validation? Because yes, routine, while providing necessary structure and predictability, can also insidiously function as a very effective, very potent psychological anesthetic. It keeps you perpetually busy, conveniently distracted from uncomfortable inner truths, often trapped within a repetitive, predictable circle of obligations, habits, and familiar patterns that slowly, subtly, yet inexorably numbs your will, diminishes your capacity for critical, independent thought, dampens your authentic emotional responses, and fundamentally distances you from your own authentic feelings, your own deepest intuitions, your own soul's quiet guidance. But what you often fail to see, what the routine conveniently obscures, is that this apparent security, this perceived safety, offered by rigid, unquestioned routine, often comes at an exorbitantly, tragically high price. The gradual, yet potentially total loss of your inner freedom, your psychological sovereignty, your authentic aliveness. And freedom, true, psychological freedom, although many mistakenly superficially confuse it with simply having the license, the permission to do whatever they impulsively want at any given moment, is actually something far deeper, far more demanding, far more internally generated. Authentic freedom is possessing the inner courage, the unwavering integrity, the profound self-knowledge to be fundamentally true to yourself, even, and perhaps especially, when that means challenging deeply ingrained expectations, both external and internal, consciously, deliberately breaking self-limiting patterns and habits, and sometimes inevitably, painfully disappointing those people you genuinely love the most, those who may consciously or unconsciously prefer the older, more compliant, more predictable, perhaps less threatening version of you. Perhaps at this point, reading these words, a significant, perhaps paralyzing fear arises within you. But what if by choosing to be truly authentic, by shedding the old masks, by pursuing my own path, I end up losing everything I've worked so hard, perhaps my entire life, to achieve, to accumulate, to maintain? Your career, your carefully constructed reputation, your established relationships, your social standing, your financial security. And here is where another fascinating, often liberating paradox appears, one that often requires a courageous leap of faith, a willingness to trust a deeper wisdom to fully grasp. If you genuinely, truly need to constantly pretend, perform, compromise, your core values, betray your authentic self, simply to maintain what you currently possess, then in a very real, profound existential sense, it was likely never truly authentically yours in the first place, not in a sustainable, soul-aligned, genuinely fulfilling way. It was built on a fragile foundation of inauthenticity, inevitably destined to crumble. True relationships, the ones worth keeping, the ones built on mutual respect, genuine connection, authentic acceptance, projects that really matter, the ones aligned with your deepest passions, your core values, your unique contributions, achievements worth genuinely celebrating, the ones that bring lasting fulfillment, not just fleeting validation. All of these tend to survive perfectly well, often even flourish and deepen when approached, nurtured, sustained with courageous authenticity. On the contrary, it is often only by being courageously, unapologetically authentic that you finally begin to discover what really matters to you, what truly aligns with your soul's purpose, and simultaneously, crucially recognize, perhaps with startling clarity, what was simply taking up valuable space, draining your precious energy, cluttering your life, preventing your true self from emerging. Letting go creates space. In reality, if you dig beneath the surface fears, you likely have much, much less to truly fundamentally lose by embracing authenticity than your anxious, conditioned, fear-driven mind frantically imagines. And paradoxically powerfully, you potentially have infinitely more to genuinely, profoundly gain, lasting inner peace, deeper, more meaningful connection work that truly inspires and fulfills you, a profound sense of alignment, purpose, and authentic aliveness than you currently perhaps pessimistically believe possible. But of course, achieving this profound state Accessing this potential requires first taking that often terrifying yet absolutely necessary leap. The leap into the uncertain, the unknown, into a life you cannot fully control, cannot perfectly predict, cannot guarantee the outcome of, but one that finally, liberatingly will genuinely, authentically, undeniably be yours. And here again resonates the central, profoundly liberating idea of Michel de Montaigne, subtly wisely reminding us across the centuries that genuine detachment, true inner freedom, does not mean abandoning what you truly love or becoming cynically indifferent to the world and its inhabitants. Rather, it means cultivating the profound, unwavering understanding that only from a place of absolute inner freedom, free from the insidious chains of needing constant external validation, free from desperately clinging to specific outcomes you cannot ultimately control, free from the paralyzing fear of judgment or failure, can you truly, authentically love, create, build, engage, genuinely, sustainably, powerfully, authentically. Everything you possess externally, everything you cling to internally out of anxiety, insecurity, attachment, or fear, ultimately inevitably ends up possessing you, controlling you, imprisoning you. Here is the potent, life-changing message that conventional wisdom invested in maintaining the status quo rarely if ever tells you with such stark clarity. Most people live perpetually anxiously in fear of losing what they have, precisely because they have never truly courageously allowed themselves the necessary space, the psychological permission, or summoned the requisite courage to discover what might actually happen, what new possibilities might emerge if they actually deliberately, consciously lost it. They cling desperately, often pathologically, to relationships that have long since died emotionally, to jobs that drain their spirit daily, to prefabricated identities that feel safe, yet suffocatingly small, to possessions that provide fleeting comfort, but no lasting meaning. And in that very frantic, exhausting effort of desperately clinging, of resisting change, of avoiding loss, they tragically completely forget that real life, authentic life, vibrant life often begins paradoxically, powerfully, precisely at the point when you finally courageously stop clinging tenaciously, fearfully, habitually to what doesn't genuinely represent you, nourish you, align with your evolving truth. So what are you going to do now, standing at this potential threshold of awareness, holding this uncomfortable yet potentially liberating knowledge? Will you choose consciously or unconsciously to continue living largely by inertia, by habit, by fear, perpetually afraid to discover the vast untapped depths of who you truly are beneath the layers of performance and societal expectation? Or will you finally decisively summon enough inner courage, enough soul weariness with the old game, to consciously, deliberately let go of the known, the comfortable, the predictable, the safe, yet suffocating, and bravely launch yourself, perhaps trembling yet resolute, into the inherent uncertainty, the potential chaos, the terrifying yet exhilarating unknown that understandably frightens you, yet simultaneously undeniably holds the profound, sacred possibility of discovering something infinitely more valuable, more real, more lasting than any external achievement or validation. Who you really are, liberated finally from the relentless, exhausting need for external control, societal approval, and paralyzing, life-diminishing fear. This is the fundamental existential path Michel de Montaigne himself documented with unflinching honesty, profound insight, and remarkable self-awareness in the quiet solitude of his reflective tower, centuries ago, and in essence stripped down to its core psychological truth. It is the very same challenging yet potentially profoundly rewarding path that now lies open, beckoning, perhaps demanding, before you. Will you dare finally to walk it? Or will you settle, perhaps resignedly, perhaps fearfully, for continuing to be merely a passive, perhaps comfortable yet ultimately unfulfilled spectator of your own precious, fleeting, unrepeatable existence? The answer, the choice, the responsibility ultimately rests solely, entirely, irrevocably within you.